continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. She warned of peer-to-peer misinformation, and Congress listened. The New York Times profiled last year a digital leader on the battleground against anti-social media that are increasingly corrupting society. Author of the hardware startup Building Your Product, Business, and Brand, Renee Diresta is now head of policy for Data for Democracy and previously worked at O'Reilly Alpha Tech Venture Capital. Diresta, who wrote her college thesis on the influence of propaganda on the 2004 Russian election, studies the practices of manipulative automation, algorithms, and disinformation campaigns. She advised the United States Congress in anticipation of last year's testimonies of the social media executives. We were closely monitoring to see when the companies gave misleading or partial answers so that we could follow up, Diresta told the New York Times. On Wall Street, she observed an over-reliance on algorithms to identify bad actors, and later, when her son was born, saw firsthand Facebook's viral amplification of conspiratorial anti-vaccine propaganda. So today we explore this dark side of the new web. Renee, I was really heartened to read this New York Times piece, a profile of you and of the crucially important work you're doing. What has been the response since the Times article?
It's been very positive. One of the reasons that I felt that it was kind of okay to be public about it was we wanted to encourage more people to begin to participate, particularly in the tech community. So folks who have worked at platforms or been involved in technology in some capacity, built recommender systems. We feel that there's a moment now in Silicon Valley to begin to think about the impact that the technology we've been building is having on us as a society.
You and Tristan Harris and others have considered the prospect of a kind of union of concerned technologists.
Yes.
How can you take the the positive energy around that movement and execute, and get real reforms on these social media?
So I think there's a couple of different ways that you can push reform in an industry, right? One of those is market reforms. It's customers deciding that they're going to spend their dollars elsewhere or have a boycott or demand change. That's a little bit more difficult in the tech industry because the platforms are so hegemonic. Google and Facebook and Twitter are, there are other smaller search engines perhaps or other smaller social networks, but really those are the big three. And so we wanted to, absent the opportunity to have market-driven reform, the other two choices are legislative reform, which takes a very long time and is often not really effective, and then more of a self-regulatory model is kind of the third choice. And that's where you encourage the industry to begin to think about steps it should take on its own. And the Union of Concerned Technologists, the inspiration really came out of the pugwash movement and the movement of nuclear scientists to think about regulation with the Russell Einstein Manifesto and other convenings that they held to inform policymakers and have discussions as a community. So we think that there's a time to begin to have that conversation in tech right now. Conversations around design ethics, conversations around misinformation and disinformation, conversations around the way we use our devices, and Tristan focuses quite a bit on the physical and individual and interpersonal implications of the technology. So there's a number of different levels of the problem. There's personal and then there's societal. And I think it's time to really galvanize the energy that's come about in the Valley.
We've been concerned, though, since the social media executives testified, and again, it was not the CEOs, it was the counsels, the lawyers for these social media companies, that the questions that Chairman Burr and Ranking Member Warner asked and other members of the committees went unanswered. Which of the questions, if any, have been answered?
So there's an opportunity, in addition to the public hearings, to submit questions in writing and request responses in writing. They're called questions for the record.
Right.
And so we're waiting to see what comes back on those now. I think that the number one area that has been insufficiently dealt with for people is the right to know. The idea that if you were targeted, if you saw misinformation, I think it's very important that people begin to understand that this isn't something that happens to other people. This isn't, something that happens to the low intelligence or the highly partisan or the Democrats or the Republicans. This is something where these campaigns targeted everybody. And so I think that the first step in people beginning to understand the impact that this is having on us as a society is understanding that they themselves are not immune to it, and that they themselves were also potentially a target for this. So I think Senator Blumenthal is also continuing to advocate for right to know. We're waiting to see what the companies do.
I love that you said that, because I was very interested in Senator Reed of Rhode Island, his exchange, in which the corporate executive really had no idea what he was talking about. And he was saying to the executive, this is what a correction is in a newspaper, and you need to do this to all the people who saw the disinformation on their feeds.
Yeah.
And they sat there dumbfounded. Like, they didn't understand that, yes, we still operate in a society where if you need to correct a record, you tell all your readers, you tell your millions of subscribers. And they were suggesting there's no mechanism for doing that.
Right, and that's just nonsense. And the problem is, I think this stems from the companies' unwillingness to acknowledge that they're media companies. So that, I think, was another exchange that came up during the hearings, the requirement that rather than hiding behind the idea that they're a neutral tech platform and anything that's put out there, it just happens to exist and they have no responsibility for it. They do have responsibility because the algorithms are designed in such a way as to surface particular types of content over other types. So they are in fact making editorial decisions, just not in the way that a traditional media newspaper perhaps would do.
They've resisted any attempt to create an editorial board. How can you get them to frame their decision-making in a way that is consistent with the science and yet consistent with the value system, so they're not profiteering off of propaganda?
So I think one of the things that we saw was when they removed all human oversight from trending topics, when Facebook removed all human oversight from trending topics, the top 3 or 4 trends were blatantly false stories. I think one was that Megyn Kelly was fired for supporting Hillary Clinton. Then there were, just a range of other content that never should have been amplified. And I think that by itself should have been a huge red flag, indicating that the algorithm by itself was being very easily gamed and was being very consistently gamed. And I think that as we've moved forward from this, one of the most important things that I think we got out of the hearings was the beginning of an acknowledgement. It forced them to do a self-reckoning, forced them to look internally. If you recall, after the election, Mark Zuckerberg's response was, fake news is such a small percentage of what we see on Facebook, and it had no impact at all. And then we went to, it was a $100,000 ruble ad buy, and only 10 million people were impacted. 2, through the a very coordinated effort between researchers and media to really kind of open the kimono and say, no, it was hundreds of millions of users who saw this stuff, and we can identify some of the people who did. So how can you plausibly make the claim that you can't? It's just simply not true.
Renee, what do you say to the people who have withdrawn from Facebook since Zuckerberg's ineptitude and really incapacity to recognize the problem, or unwillingness to recognize the antisocial effect of his medium? Antisocial, maybe even putting it lightly. But I know myself, I stay clear of Facebook in general. I mean, we all as a media complex have our respective footprints on these social media sites, but One thing that I've proposed, was sharing this with one of your colleagues at the project you're working on, is, we each need to buy some shares of these companies and take ownership. They occasionally, and maybe more frequently now, will ask shareholders, even if you just own a couple of shares, for their input when they do surveys. And I think there was one recently at Google, and the shareholders decided not to do a study, survey, an audit, a forensic audit of the platform and the impact of the bots and trolls on the platform. Would buying shares make an impact? What do you say to people who have otherwise withdrawn from these media?
So as far as the shares, I think that it really is platform dependent. I believe with Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg still controls enough shares that there is, I'm not sure to what extent the shareholder votes really have an impact. But I think that we've started to see people, particularly on Twitter, use their direct channel to the leadership to communicate a very specific point of view. I think perhaps you remember when every time Twitter makes a change, so, we go from stars to hearts, we get 280 characters instead of 140 characters. There's a litany of people, thousands and thousands of comments back to Jack Dorsey that just say, but what about the Nazis? And it's incredible to see. It's usually really funny also because it's just it's users really kind of hammering home the extent to which they're disappointed by the product direction that the company is taking in making very small tweaks around the margin, but not really dealing with the core central problem that Twitter has, which is harassment. So I think that, I'm not sure that buying the shares really makes the difference in this case, but doing things to, reach out to board members. I've seen people do that too, lobby the board members, say, hey, I've had some really serious concerns and I can reach you on Twitter, and so I'm going to tell you exactly what I think about what's happening at the company whose board you sit on. As far as stepping back, I still use Twitter, Facebook, and Google pretty heavily. I know that I may be, in fact, a little bit unique of people who believe that there are problems, but also really love the tools and the promise of the tools. And that's where I think that's actually one of the things that motivates me, which is a feeling that this can be so much better. We can return to what Twitter was like maybe a few years back when the bot problem was not quite the epidemic it is today. We can use things like Facebook's groups, where I've met and made some wonderful friends in there. I think the core underlying mission of the companies is a valuable one. It's just that the inertia and the lack of response is unfortunately hurting their user base and making people withdraw. I sincerely hope that seeing this consistent withdrawal, public criticism from folks like Chamath and Sandy and a number of other former insiders who've written very unfavorable op-eds recently, it's Sean Parker. I think that the effect of that may be, more than anything else, to inspire them to take an inventory and have a corporate reckoning.
You said you have hope about Twitter returning to its 2012, 2013 state, but it's pretty clear that Facebook will never return to its pre-advertising core. And the inertia that you identify is driving it and leading the absence of any kind of moral compass guiding who buys ads or who doesn't. In that sense, I don't think you'll ever get back to a 2008 Facebook or 2010 Facebook. And I would be on Facebook more regularly if it was that platform.
Yeah, I think the challenge, the real hard problem here is that the tools were not misused by the people who ran influence campaigns. The tools are not misused by propagandists, right? These are tools to reach people. These are tools to monetize people's attention. And the very recommender systems, they're designed to make sure that you see what you, quote unquote, should see in order to achieve the highest rate of return for the advertisers that are actually the customers of Facebook and Twitter. You are not the customer, you're the user. And that's a subtle distinction, but it's a very, very important one. I think that the features were built in such a way as to keep people on the platforms for as long as possible, because as long as you're on the platform, they can continue to serve you ads. So the fundamental challenge here is there a way to reconcile, how do they reconcile the tension between maximization of ad revenue with showing people content that is in fact beneficial for society, or acknowledging that maybe people shouldn't spend 18 of 24 hours a day glued to their phones. And so these are the areas where we have to see to what extent the platforms can wean themselves away from the advertising business model.
That's exactly what I asked one of the founders of Twitter right here in 2014. Would you ever impose a constraint on being a good Samaritan? You believe in 140 characters, or now 280 characters. What about ensuring that there is goodness, or at least the viability of goodness and knowledge outweighs the viability of hate? And you can maximize people's attention span through a subscription model,
right,
that was not beholden to advertisers. But in that sense, Facebook and Twitter, it would be unlikely that they would resituate their position to do subscription-based.
Yeah, it is unlikely.
I mean, unless you want to pay for the Facebook of pre-advertising bonanza, and frankly, there's not very much I want to see on my Facebook feed anymore.
Right. And some of that is, it's a feedback loop, because people have gotten frustrated and left. I think Twitter is the most, kind of clear example of this, which is Twitter, it communicates monthly average users as one of its KPIs, key performance indicators for Wall Street. And the unfortunate reality is that many of the most active users are the bots and what the term is called cyborg, people who automate their account some percentage of the time and then take the reins just enough so that they're not a fully automated account. Those folks have a lot of activity, and a lot of the discord and a lot of the fighting and a lot of the hate that you see on the platform actually engenders a ton of engagement because people respond to it. And unfortunately, that looks good for those metrics. And if Twitter were to go and clear off the bots from the platform, researchers estimate it's about 9 to 15% of the accounts are bots. Twitter claims it's 5%, maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle there. But ultimately, at some point, I think that it's actually the advertisers that have an incredible amount of power here, because the advertisers can say, you showing my ad to 15% bots, that's ad fraud. I shouldn't be paying to show my ads to fake people. How are you dealing with this? What are you doing to have an impact here? So I think that there are opportunities for the advertisers and the big companies to really come to the table as participants in the reformation process, so to speak, to say, we don't want our ads shown over terrible YouTube videos. We don't want our ads targeted at fake people.
I like you use the term reformation process, right? The reformation of social media, the second coming. I don't see a change on the horizon as long as those same companies are beholden to ultimately their profit-making capacity. And if you can do a forensic audit and show how a company is paying disproportionate to what it's getting because bots are on the receiving end of their ads on Twitter or Facebook, well, maybe there's some there as far as, but tell us about the solutions, because I said on a show recently that the white supremacists had essentially hijacked the internet as a eugenics experiment, and Mark Zuckerberg has actually played into that eugenics experiment by allowing people to state not their preferences only for the Yankees or Socrates, but for white people or brown people or purple or yellow people, and that right there is the demise of civilization.
You're talking about the targeting.
The targeting
Yeah.
of people based on ethnicity, frankly, because they hate certain people.
It's I think there have been a number of instances, people who are renting apartments trying to not have their ads shown to minorities, which I'm pretty sure is actually blatantly illegal if done off Facebook.
And this was even more viscerally.
Yeah, no, you're talking about the
degenerative than
ProPublica, the Jew hater.
Right.
Yeah, no, that was
the
an
idea
awful.
that you're making money off of ads that are celebrating a vicious cause, an immoral cause, to bring more people to a page that is the Klan.
In Silicon Valley, we love to think that there's an algorithm that solves everything. You know, it's one of the biggest. It's kind of a running joke in the Valley. It's a punchline. There's an app for that, right? No matter what it is, there's an app for it. There's an algorithm for it. Tech will fix it. We joke about it, mostly self-deprecatingly, but in some cases it's true. I think with this particular situation, we're faced with the reckoning that there is really no app or algorithmic fix that can handle the kinds of things that we're seeing on the platforms. And with regard to that, the way that those targeting features were generated was because a sufficient number of people on the platform had typed them in under employer. I think School of Hard Knocks is something that you would see under employer, and so you could ad target for people who went to the School of Hard Knocks. So it was pulling from what users had entered, and so there was no oversight. I think this is the problem, which is, one, there's no people, so nobody looks at that. A human would have seen that in 5 seconds and said, no, we're not going to accept that ad spend. It actually does violate the terms of service to do that sort of thing, but because they make their money having a self-serve, low-friction model, they do everything they can to keep people out of that process, and then you see things like this, where the algorithm doesn't know what it's recommending. Another example I talk about a lot of the time is it takes people who are prone to belief in one conspiracy theory and begins to feed them content related to other conspiracy theories because it knows that that content is going to resonate with that person. This is a dumb algorithmic decision. The algorithm doesn't actually know what it's recommending because Facebook has no editorial oversight saying, you know what, we're not going to serve anti-government conspiracies to various types of truthers and things like that. Maybe that's not something we want to actively suggest. So there's this is where the conversation about media and editorial oversight comes in. It's so central to the conversation, which is at some point you really just need people thinking critically about this. I think they're so afraid of being seen as partisan in one way or another, or as they're concerned about being called censorship. They're concerned about allegations of censorship, and it's paralyzed them from taking steps that I think most of mainstream society would actually welcome at this point.
Very much so. And the measure we hosted recently, the CEO and lead advisor of the Counter Extremism Project, the movement of YouTube to remove an Al-Qaeda terrorist and cleric's postings. Yep. That was an editorial decision made. But is there any way that there can be some kind of joint effort across platforms to create that curation?
So this is something that the Union of Concerned Technologists, which doesn't exist in a formal sense yet, but this is one of the things that we talk about a lot right now, which is the idea that this is a system-level problem. It isn't just Facebook, it isn't just Google, it isn't just Twitter, because particularly when you look at things like the Russian front content, that appeared everywhere. That appeared on everything from smaller social networks like Reddit all the way up to multiple properties on Google and Facebook. And so if you have a systems level problem and everyone is taking a piecemeal solution, that doesn't really solve very much.
Based on your insight, is there finally a consciousness, a cognizance on the part of Jack and Mark and company that they need to do something more? That if the FCC is not going to step in, which it may not ultimately, it threatens to, but it probably won't, that they're going to have to do that. This
Yes.
union is going to have to do that.
Yes. No, I think that they see, look, the threat of regulation and the specter of those hearings got more done in terms of acknowledgement of, or a voluntary recognition that what they'd been lobbying for so long with regard to being exempt from ad disclosure rules for political ads, they took that off the table voluntarily. That wasn't pushed through legislation, that was done voluntarily. The Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which is a self-regulatory body of all of the tech platforms, Snap, Google, Twitter, Reddit, they're all in there. it took several years after the ISIS problem emerged to get there, and it took pressure from Europe as well, but there's the nascent beginnings of a thing. And so when I called it a reformation, I really do believe that there's an opportunity now to take that momentum. And one of the things I always say is, all right, we got there on ISIS, it took us 3 years, but as a, as a community, as an industry, we're getting there. Why not expand the mandate to include countering propaganda? Why don't we look at influence operations, information warfare? Why are we limited only to focusing on one adversary? I think one thing that, in my own experience, has been that there are many, many different types of actors that are all using the same tools to achieve disinformation and misinformation, to run disinformation and misinformation campaigns. And there are places where you can intercede in the, in the sort of systemic propagation of that content if there's a backbone and a willingness to do that.
And the companies are not alien to or unwilling to listen to the Union of Concerned Technologists who have spoken out?
They have not been unwilling, no. They've been, there are people within the companies who are making these arguments internally, and they have an incredible degree of clout and influence, and that's one of the reasons why we really feel that it has to be a community-driven, industry-driven effort. Self-regulation has come to other industries through whistleblowers being upset and companies deciding that they're going to take steps to protect their customers.
Final question.
Yeah.
What is a realistic objective in this year of 2018 that we can say at the end of the day, the Russians didn't interfere in our midterm congressional elections? Is that too high a bar to?
No, I don't think so. I think that that's a very reasonable ask. I think that transparency and accountability, those are the two things that we're going for. On that front, if you have an internal team with, sharing information across the platforms, I think that a task force can accomplish that while we fix the more systemic problems.
Well, maybe it's a wish list or a wishful thinking that these companies can resolutely determine how they're going to counteract these malevolent forces, propaganda, bots, and trolls. But even if the Union of Concerned Technologists, in concert with these companies, came out with their own rules of the future, that would be huge progress.
I think so. I think it's something that's very important for the industry to recognize that, we've been around for a while now. These aren't startups anymore. It's time to take responsibility.
Thank you, Renee. And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and to the corporate community Mutual of America.